What if the most influential woman of the Middle Ages wasn't a queen or a warrior, but a mystic nun whose visions shaped an entire era? Tonight, let Hildegard's quiet journey steady your heart as you discover her remarkable story. A chronically ill girl, offered to a monastery as the 10th child of noble parents, a common practice made more urgent by her persistent illness, would grow up to become widely known as a visionary, composer, and advisor to popes and emperors. Hildegard von Bingen's journey from forgotten child to doctor of the Church shows how God uses our perceived weaknesses. Her visions began in childhood. Bright illuminations she called living shadows of light. Even today, an online bardcore channel playfully honors her name, creating medieval-style covers as a musical homage to her legacy. But this story begins long before such recognition, in a stone castle where a frail child watched the world from her window. Born in 1098 into the noble von Bingen family in the German Rhineland, young Hildegard lived with a frailty that worried her parents deeply. Her body betrayed her daily with weakness and pain that doctors could not explain or cure. While other children ran and played in the courtyard below her window, she watched from inside, too weak to join them. Her parents had wealth, land, and position, but their youngest daughter brought them concern instead of the joy they had hoped for. In medieval times, a daughter's health determined her future. Strong girls married well and bore children. Weak ones became burdens their families struggled to bear. Hildegard's constant illness made her parents fear she would never find a husband or fulfill the basic expectations of noble women. They watched their child grow thinner and paler, while their hopes for her normal life faded with each passing season. But something extraordinary marked this sickly child apart from others. Hildegard saw things that made adults uncomfortable and confused. Bright lights danced before her eyes when no candles burned nearby. Shadows moved with purpose across walls where nothing cast them. She described these visions using words beyond her years. Hildegard later described these early experiences as the reflection of the living light, a phrase she used repeatedly throughout her life when recounting her childhood encounters with the divine. The lights grew brighter as Hildegard aged, not dimmer as her parents hoped they would. These were not the fevered dreams of a sick child or the fantasies of an overactive imagination. Something deeper stirred within her young spirit. The visions came with clarity that unsettled the adults around her. She spoke of seeing divine mysteries with the confidence of someone much older and wiser than her years suggested. Her parents faced an impossible choice. What do you do with a daughter who claims to see heaven's light but lacks the strength to manage an earthly household? Medieval society offered few options for girls who could not marry or bear children. The family needed a solution that would provide for Hildegard while acknowledging her unusual spiritual gifts. Traditional paths seemed closed to their visionary child. The German nobility had developed a practical custom for dealing with such challenges. They often gave their weakest or most unusual children to monasteries and convents. This practice served multiple purposes beyond simple charity. Families gained spiritual insurance by dedicating a child to God's service. The children received care, education, and purpose within religious communities. Parents could feel they had turned a difficult situation into a blessing for their entire household. Her family followed the custom of dedicating a child to the church. Hildegard's ill health and this established practice together led to her placement in religious life. The family reached a decision that would echo through centuries of church history. They chose to place their strange, visionary daughter with Uta of Sponheim, the most respected holy woman in their region. Uta lived as an anchoress, sealed away from the world in a cell attached to the Disibodenberg monastery. She had renounced marriage, wealth, and comfort to pursue perfect union with God through prayer and fasting. This choice represented both practical wisdom and spiritual intuition. Uta could provide the specialized guidance that Hildegard's unusual gifts required. The arrangement would ensure the girl received proper religious education while allowing her visions to develop under expert spiritual direction. The family hoped their daughter would find peace and purpose within the monastery's protective walls. Sources differ about the exact timing of Hildegard's placement. Some suggest she was offered as an oblate as early as age 8, while other documentary evidence ties her formal vows to 1112, when she would have been about 14. Regardless of the precise age, young Hildegard entered Uta's care carrying the seeds of a revolution no one could have imagined. Her perceived weakness became the very condition that opened her heart to divine revelation. The frailty that worried her parents created space within her spirit for experiences beyond ordinary human comprehension. What seemed like divine punishment was actually divine preparation for unprecedented service. This sickly child would mature into a woman whose authority challenged the most powerful men of her age. Popes would seek her counsel. Emperors would correspond with her. Bishops would travel great distances to hear her speak. The girl who could not run and play with other children would compose music that still moves audiences to tears 8 centuries later. Her physical limitations never diminished her spiritual capacity. Instead, they seem to have intensified her connection to divine mysteries that transcended bodily experience. Her family's difficult decision to surrender their unusual daughter to religious life set in motion events that would influence Christian thought for generations. The monastery that received this frail, visionary child gained a future saint whose writings would expand medieval understanding of God, creation, and the human soul. Hildegard's story began with what appeared to be tragic limitation, but would unfold into extraordinary spiritual achievement. Her childhood weakness became the foundation for adult strength that challenged earthly powers with heavenly authority. The noble family who worried about their daughter's future could never have predicted that her name would outlive theirs by centuries. Their sickly child would become one of history's most influential religious figures, proving that God's plans often work through our apparent disadvantages to create unexpected blessing. But placing a child with divine visions required more than good intentions. It demanded a mentor of exceptional wisdom and spiritual depth. Uta of Sponheim possessed the spiritual depth needed for such a task. Born into German nobility like Hildegard herself, Uta had chosen the most extreme form of religious life available to medieval women. She lived as a recluse, dedicating herself completely to prayer and contemplation at the Disibodenberg monastery. In 1112, she became formally enclosed, sealing herself away from the world in a small cell attached to the monastery walls. When Hildegard came under Uta's care, the older woman faced a challenge unlike any other teacher had ever encountered. How do you guide a child who claims God speaks directly to her? Most adults would have dismissed such statements as childish fantasy or dangerous delusion. Medieval society feared false prophets and religious enthusiasm that challenged established authority. Yet Uta recognized something authentic in this unusual girl that demanded careful attention rather than quick dismissal. Uta had renounced the world completely to pursue perfect holiness through prayer and fasting. Her cell measured only a few feet in each direction, containing nothing but the basic necessities for survival. She received communion through a small window and spoke to visitors through a tiny opening in the wall. This self-imposed imprisonment represented the ultimate sacrifice a medieval woman could make for God. She had given up marriage, children, comfort, freedom, and social connection to focus entirely on divine union. The contrast between teacher and student created an unusual educational environment. Uta lived in absolute stillness, while Hildegard's mind buzzed with cosmic visions. The older woman had chosen silence and solitude, while her young charge overflowed with descriptions of heavenly light and divine voices. Yet this pairing proved providential for both women. Uta provided the stability and wisdom that Hildegard needed, while Hildegard brought fresh spiritual energy to her mentor's contemplative practice. Uta began Hildegard's education with the essential skills expected for religious women. She taught her student to read and write, opening access to scripture and basic religious texts. The Psalms became Hildegard's daily bread as Uta guided her through the complex rhythms of monastic prayer. Music formed another crucial part of this early education. The older woman taught her to play the psaltery, a stringed instrument used in medieval worship, and introduced her to the theological understanding that music served as a bridge between earthly and heavenly realms. What set Uta apart from other religious teachers was her remarkable response to Hildegard's visions. Instead of dismissing them as childish imagination or dangerous pride, she listened carefully to every detail her student shared. She asked probing questions designed to help Hildegard understand the difference between authentic spiritual experiences and mere fantasy. This careful discernment process taught Hildegard to test her visions against scripture and church teaching while maintaining confidence in their divine origin. Under Uta's patient guidance, Hildegard learned that her visions carried sacred responsibility rather than personal privilege. The older woman helped her understand that God gives unusual gifts not for the recipient's glory, but for service to the broader Christian community. Other nuns joined Uta and Hildegard in their community at Disibodenberg, creating a small group of religious women dedicated to contemplative prayer and spiritual growth. Uta served as their leader while continuing to guide Hildegard's unique development. This community provided the secure environment that allowed Hildegard's gifts to mature without premature exposure to external pressures or criticism. The older woman's influence extended beyond formal education to shape Hildegard's entire understanding of religious authority. Uta had claimed her own spiritual authority by choosing extreme asceticism that commanded respect from male religious leaders. She taught Hildegard that women could exercise legitimate spiritual influence through complete dedication to divine service rather than conventional social roles. When Uta died in 1136, she left behind a spiritual daughter prepared to assume unprecedented responsibilities. Hildegard was elected magistra, head of their religious community, with confidence rooted in decades of careful preparation. The confused child who had arrived years earlier had become a mature mystic ready to step into leadership. Her more complex theological training and Latin refinement would later be aided by male confessors and secretaries, particularly Volmar, who would become her faithful tutor and scribe. Uta's patient mentorship had transformed raw visionary gift into refined spiritual insight. Her recognition of divine fire in an unusual child enabled Hildegard to become one of history's most influential religious women. The teacher's legacy lived on through her students' revolutionary achievements that expanded possibilities for Christian women throughout history. Take a slow breath and imagine the quiet strength that flows from one faithful heart to another. Uta's gentle guidance had prepared Hildegard for a calling she could not yet imagine. Sometimes God uses the patient witness of one soul to kindle courage in another, transforming fear into readiness for extraordinary service. But Hildegard's greatest test still lay ahead. At 42 years old, she would face a divine command that would terrify her to the core. Around 1141, a divine voice broke into Hildegard's quiet life with an instruction that would change everything. She was about 42 years old when she experienced what she understood as a clear and urgent call to write down the visions flowing through her mind. The familiar walls of Disibodenberg monastery suddenly filled with blazing light more intense than any vision she had experienced before. The instruction came with words that burned themselves into her memory. She must cry out and write down the divine revelations she received. This was no gentle suggestion or mystical impression. Hildegard interpreted this as divine command to become a public teacher of heavenly mysteries. The call demanded immediate obedience without offering any comfort about the consequences that would follow. Terror gripped her heart as she understood what this calling really meant. Medieval women were absolutely forbidden from teaching theology or claiming spiritual authority over educated men. The Church had strict rules about who could interpret Scripture and explain divine mysteries to others. Only men with proper theological training possessed the right to instruct believers about religious truth. Women belonged in silent submission to male religious leaders. The social barriers seemed impossible to overcome. How could a cloistered nun dare to write theological treatises that bishops and abbots would be expected to read and respect? Medieval society viewed women as intellectually inferior and spiritually dangerous when they claimed direct access to divine knowledge. False female prophets had caused problems throughout church history. Religious authorities remained deeply suspicious of any woman who insisted that divine revelation came through her visions. She resisted for a time and suffered physically before. With the help of her confessor Volmar and others, she began recording the visions. 4 months after receiving this calling, Hildegard wrestled with internal conflict that made her physically sick. Her body began to fail as her spirit struggled between what she believed was obedience to divine instruction and fear of human judgment. She could not eat properly or sleep peacefully. The weight of her calling pressed down on her like a heavy stone. Every day brought fresh awareness of how impossible her situation seemed from any earthly perspective. The illness grew worse as she continued to resist writing down her visions. Her community watched with concern, as their abbess weakened under some mysterious burden she would not explain. Hildegard knew she needed to respond to what she understood as divine waiting for her obedience, but she also knew that following this call would expose her to ridicule, condemnation, and possible charges of heresy. The stakes could not have been higher for a woman in her position. Finally, she made the crucial decision to confide in Volmar, her trusted confessor and the monk who served as spiritual director for her community. Volmar had known Hildegard for years and had witnessed the authenticity of her mystical experiences. When she told him about the divine instruction to write, he recognized the genuine authority behind her calling. Instead of dismissing her fears or encouraging her to ignore the vision, he offered to help her respond to what she believed was divine will. Volmar became her faithful scribe and collaborator in the massive project that lay ahead. Hildegard received her visions in German, the language of her daily thoughts and prayers. However, theological works needed to be written in Latin to gain respect from church scholars and authorities. Volmar possessed the advanced Latin skills necessary to translate her German revelations into proper theological language that educated readers would take seriously. Together, they began the monumental task of documenting her extraordinary mystical experiences. The work they produced became known as Symphonia, compiled over the next decade from 1142 to 1151. This title means "Know the Ways of the Lord" and perfectly captured the purpose of Hildegard's visions. She believed these revelations showed the spiritual pathways that led from earthly confusion to heavenly clarity. Each vision provided guidance for souls seeking to understand divine mysteries and follow divine commands. Symphonia eventually contained 26 separate visions arranged in 3 major sections. The first part focused on the relationship between Creator and creation. The second explored the redemption accomplished through Christ's incarnation and sacrifice. The third section described the ongoing work of sanctification through the Holy Spirit and the sacraments. Each vision came with detailed explanations that made complex theological concepts accessible to ordinary believers. The visions themselves were unlike anything found in traditional theological textbooks. Hildegard saw symbolic images that revealed spiritual truths through vivid metaphors and dramatic scenes. She witnessed cosmic battles between good and evil, observed the structure of heavenly realms, and received insights into the deepest mysteries of salvation. These were not abstract philosophical discussions, but living encounters with divine reality. Each revelation required careful explanation to help readers understand its spiritual significance. Hildegard provided commentary that connected her mystical experiences to scripture and church teaching. She showed how her visions confirmed traditional Christian doctrine while offering fresh insights into familiar truths. The explanations covered everything from the nature of God to practical guidance for Christian living to prophecies about the end of the world. Word of this remarkable visionary work spread quickly through the medieval church network. Monasteries copied portions of Scivias and shared them with other religious communities. Bishops and abbots heard reports about the unusual theological insights emerging from a previously unknown abbess. Church leaders began to pay attention to this woman, who claimed divine authority for her revolutionary religious teachings. The project that had begun with what Hildegard experienced as terrifying divine instruction gradually became the foundation of her authority as a legitimate voice in the medieval world. Church officials could not easily dismiss her work because it demonstrated profound theological knowledge and remained faithful to orthodox Christian doctrine. Her visions provided fresh perspectives on familiar religious truths while never contradicting established church teaching. But writing down her visions was only the beginning. Soon, the highest authorities in the church would need to decide whether her extraordinary claims deserved official recognition or condemnation. Pope Eugenius III himself would examine her case through a formal commission. Picture the weight of that moment when the highest religious authority in Europe decides to investigate whether your visions come from heaven or human imagination. This supreme test arrived for Hildegard in 1147, when papal commissioners traveled to examine her writings and determine the authenticity of her mystical claims. The papal commissioners were not casual observers sent to satisfy idle curiosity. These were some of the most learned theologians of the medieval age, men who had spent decades studying scripture, church doctrine, and the subtle differences between authentic divine revelation and religious fraud. They knew exactly what questions to ask and which warning signs to watch for when examining claims of mystical experience. The investigation carried enormous significance for Hildegard as she prepared to face this official examination. If the papal commission declared her visions false or heretical, she could be condemned as a delusional woman who had misled her religious community. Medieval authorities dealt seriously with false prophets who claimed divine authority without proper validation. Her entire life's work depended on these expert judges and their careful examination of her theological writings. The commission included bishops and abbots who had encountered numerous people claiming divine visions throughout their religious careers. They understood that medieval Christianity attracted many individuals who sought spiritual authority through claims of supernatural experience. Some were sincere but mistaken about the source of their visions. Others were deliberate frauds who used religious enthusiasm to gain power over gullible believers. The commissioners needed to distinguish authentic divine revelation from human delusion or deception. They questioned Hildegard carefully about every aspect of her mystical experiences. How did the visions begin? What exactly did she see and hear during these supernatural encounters? How did she know the difference between divine revelation and ordinary human thoughts? The examination continued as the learned men explored every detail of her claims and tested her responses against orthodox Christian teaching. The commissioners examined her written works with scholarly precision, searching for any doctrinal errors that might reveal false teaching disguised as divine revelation. They compared her theological insights to established church doctrine to ensure that her visions confirmed rather than contradicted traditional Christian truth. Every statement about God, salvation, and spiritual life underwent careful scrutiny to detect possible problems. They also tested Hildegard's theological knowledge to determine whether her insights came from divine inspiration or simply from extensive study of existing religious texts. Could she demonstrate understanding that exceeded what normal human learning might provide? Did her explanations of complex spiritual mysteries reveal supernatural wisdom that transcended ordinary educational background? These questions helped distinguish between scholarly achievement and authentic prophetic gift. Bernard of Clairvaux had already expressed interest in Hildegard's case. adding weight to the papal investigation. Bernard was the most influential monk in Europe, a man whose opinions carried tremendous influence with popes, bishops, and secular rulers. His support could establish Hildegard's reputation throughout Christian Europe. His opposition could damage her credibility permanently. Everyone understood that Bernard's judgment would heavily influence the final papal decision. The medieval church had encountered numerous false prophets throughout its history, making religious authorities cautious about endorsing new claims of divine revelation. Many sincere but mistaken individuals had caused confusion by insisting that God had given them special messages for the Christian community. Others had used claims of mystical experience to justify teachings that contradicted Scripture and church tradition. The papal commissioners needed to protect the church from both types of error. The investigation took place against broader concerns about religious enthusiasm and unauthorized teaching that challenged established church authority. Medieval Christianity maintained strict controls over who could interpret Scripture and explain divine mysteries to believers. The commissioners understood that approving Hildegard's visions would set important precedents for how the Church handled similar claims from other mystical figures in the future. They deliberated carefully, weighing all the evidence they had gathered through questioning, examination of writings, and consultation with local religious authorities who knew Hildegard personally. Their decision would affect not only her individual case, but the entire medieval understanding of how God continues to reveal divine truth through human instruments. They could not reach their conclusion lightly. The commissioners also considered the practical effects of Hildegard's teaching on her religious community and the broader Christian population. Had her visions produced good spiritual fruit in the lives of those who heard her message? Did her guidance lead people toward greater holiness and deeper faith? These practical considerations helped distinguish between authentic divine revelation and mere human imagination or spiritual deception. Church authorities knew that their decision would send a clear message about the legitimacy of mystical experience as a source of religious authority in medieval Christianity. Approving Hildegard's visions would encourage other potential visionaries to seek similar recognition. The stakes extended far beyond one woman's personal claims. After careful examination, portions of her work were read at the Synod of Trier in 1147–48, where Pope Eugenius himself heard them. The Papal Commission reached their momentous decision. They declared Hildegard's visions authentic divine revelations and gave her explicit permission to continue writing down everything she saw and heard in her supernatural encounters. Pope Eugenius wrote her a letter of encouragement, officially approving her mystical experiences as genuine. This papal approval was extraordinarily rare in medieval times. Few visionaries received such formal ecclesiastical endorsement of their supernatural claims. The blessing transformed Hildegard's status completely within the medieval church hierarchy and the broader Christian community. Church leaders who might have dismissed her teachings as female presumption now had to treat her visions as legitimate divine revelation. With papal blessing, Hildegard gained spiritual authority that rivaled bishops and abbots throughout Europe. Her writings gained credibility that opened doors to influence she could never have achieved without formal ecclesiastical endorsement. The approval established the foundation for everything she would accomplish during the remaining decades of her life. But divine authority sometimes demands choices that earthly powers cannot understand or accept. Hildegard would soon face a choice that tested whether her divine calling could overcome earthly resistance. Around 1150, she asked Abbot Kuno for permission to found a new convent at Rupertsburg, a site near the Rhine River that she believed God had chosen for her community. The request seemed reasonable enough on the surface, but it carried revolutionary implications that threatened the established order at Disibodenberg monastery. Abbot Kuno refused her request with fury that shocked everyone who witnessed his reaction. Hildegard's community brought enormous prestige to his monastery through her growing reputation as a divine prophet. pilgrims traveled from distant lands to seek her counsel and receive her blessing. These visitors brought generous donations that enriched Disibodenberg significantly. Noble families sent their daughters to join Hildegard's community, along with substantial dowries that supported the entire monastery. Kuno saw all this wealth and influence slipping away if Hildegard departed with her nuns. Medieval abbesses were supposed to obey their male superiors without question or argument. The church hierarchy placed women under the authority of abbots, bishops, and other male religious leaders who made all-important decisions for female communities. Hildegard's bold demand to move her nuns challenged this fundamental structure of religious authority that had governed monastery life for centuries. The conflict took a dramatic turn when Hildegard fell mysteriously ill. She became weak and bedridden, unable to eat properly or participate in community prayers. Her condition grew worse each day as she lay suffering in her cell. The community watched with growing alarm as their beloved abbess wasted away under some invisible burden that no doctor could diagnose or treat effectively. Hildegard interpreted her illness as connected to the delayed move, believing that her suffering would continue until she could obey what she understood as God's command to relocate. This explanation placed enormous pressure on Abbot Kuno, who did not want to be responsible for preventing a recognized prophet from following what she claimed was divine will. Whether the illness was truly divine pressure or simply the physical toll of prolonged conflict remains unclear to modern observers, but her conviction about its meaning was absolute. Her nuns supported her completely despite the enormous risks this decision involved for their own futures. They faced losing everything that provided security and meaning in their lives. Disibodenberg had been their home for decades. They knew every stone in its walls and every path through its gardens. The monastery provided them with food, shelter, and a clear place within the established religious order. Moving to an unknown location meant abandoning all these comforts for uncertainty and possible hardship. The proposed site at Rupertsburg was little more than wilderness when Hildegard first announced her plans to relocate there. This location near Bingen offered beautiful views of the Rhine River, but lacked the buildings, infrastructure, and resources necessary to support a community of religious women. Constructing a proper convent would require enormous amounts of money, labor, and time that the community did not possess. The practical challenges seemed almost impossible to overcome without substantial outside support. Church authorities throughout the region pressured Hildegard to submit to established male authority and abandon her plans for independence. They argued that proper religious women should accept the guidance of their male superiors rather than claiming direct commands from heaven that contradicted earthly authority. Several bishops and abbots wrote letters urging her to return to obedient submission and stop causing scandal through her defiant behavior. The pressure intensified as Hildegard's illness continued without improvement. Some religious leaders suggested that her suffering proved God disapproved of her plans to leave Disibodenberg. They argued that authentic divine visions would never command actions that violated church hierarchy and disturbed established religious communities. These arguments created additional stress for her already suffering community. Hildegard remained absolutely firm in her conviction that God required this move despite all earthly opposition. She insisted that her authority came directly from heaven rather than human religious structures. Divine commands took priority over church hierarchy when the two conflicted. Her illness would continue until she obeyed what she believed was God's will, regardless of how many bishops and abbots opposed her decision. This unwavering position shocked medieval society that expected women to defer to male religious authority in all matters. Finally, Abbot Kuno relented. Whether moved by genuine concern for Hildegard's health, fear of opposing a recognized visionary, or pressure from other church authorities, he granted permission for the move. The decision marked a turning point that would reshape medieval understanding of female religious authority. Despite all opposition from powerful church leaders, Hildegard successfully established her independent convent at Rupertsburg through determination that amazed her contemporaries. Wealthy supporters provided the financial resources needed to construct proper buildings for the relocated community. Skilled craftsmen transformed the wilderness site into a beautiful monastery that could house dozens of nuns. The project required several years to complete, but eventually created a center of female religious authority unprecedented in medieval Europe. Her mysterious illness disappeared completely once the community settled into their new home at Rupertsburg. Hildegard regained her strength and resumed her active ministry with renewed vigor. This dramatic recovery convinced many observers that her move had indeed followed divine will rather than human stubbornness. The coincidence seemed too remarkable to explain through natural causes alone. The successful establishment of Rupertsburg proved that faithful persistence could overcome institutional resistance when divine calling demanded independence. Hildegard would later found a second convent at Ibingen in 1165, demonstrating that her first victory was not simply an isolated exception, but part of a larger pattern of expanding female religious authority. Her wilderness convent became the foundation for unprecedented spiritual leadership that would soon extend far beyond monastery walls. The woman who had fought so hard for independence was about to discover that divine authority sometimes demanded even bolder action in the wider world. In her later life, Hildegard undertook 4 preaching tours across Germany in the 1150s through 1170s, notably in the 1160s. Picture a medieval abbess standing before crowds of men, boldly condemning corrupt bishops and calling for church reform. Take a moment to imagine the impression of a woman preacher speaking with divine authority in a medieval cathedral, her voice echoing off stone walls as shocked faces stared back at her. This scene played out repeatedly as Hildegard spoke publicly to mixed audiences of clergy and lay people in an age when church custom normally forbade women from such activities. Medieval women were not allowed to preach publicly, especially to men. Church law strictly prohibited females from teaching or correcting male religious leaders in any public setting. Women belonged in silent submission to male authority within the religious hierarchy. They could pray, sing, and serve within their convents, but they could never claim the right to instruct men about spiritual matters or criticize clerical behavior before public audiences. Hildegard's tours represented a shocking violation of church law and social custom that left her contemporaries struggling to understand how she dared attempt such forbidden activities. Yet her papal approval as an authentic visionary provided protection that other women lacked. Church authorities could not easily silence someone whose visions had received official recognition as divine revelation. Her prophetic calling created unprecedented opportunities for public ministry that transcended normal gender restrictions. She traveled to major cities like Mainz, Cologne, and Trier, confronting clerical corruption and moral decay wherever she discovered it festering within church communities. Her journey to each location required careful planning and substantial resources. Medieval travel was difficult and dangerous, especially for women who needed protection and proper accommodation. Yet Hildegard pursued these demanding tours with determination that amazed those who witnessed her commitment to delivering God's message regardless of personal cost. Her sermons were fierce and uncompromising, calling out specific abuses and demanding immediate reform from bishops and abbots who had grown comfortable in their corruption. She spoke about priests who lived with women in violation of their celibacy vows. She condemned religious leaders who sold church offices for personal profit. She challenged bishops who ignored their pastoral responsibilities while pursuing wealth and political power. Her words cut through polite social conventions to expose uncomfortable truths that many preferred to keep hidden. Some clergy welcomed her prophetic voice as a necessary challenge to widespread problems that threatened the Church's spiritual health and moral credibility. These reform-minded leaders recognized that corruption had spread throughout many religious communities. They appreciated Hildegard's courage in speaking truths that few others dared express publicly. Her divine authority provided legitimacy for criticisms that might have been dismissed if they came from ordinary human sources without supernatural validation. However, other religious leaders were outraged that a mere woman dared to criticize their behavior publicly before mixed audiences of men and women. They viewed her preaching tours as dangerous precedents that could encourage other women to challenge male religious authority. If one abbess could travel freely and condemn bishops openly, what would prevent other females from making similar claims about divine calling? Her example threatened the entire system of male dominance that governed medieval church life. The political situation was complicated by the ongoing conflict between Pope Alexander III and Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, forcing Hildegard to navigate dangerous factional disputes that could have destroyed her influence if she chose the wrong side. The Papal Schism created competing claims to legitimate church authority. Different bishops supported different popes, creating confusion about which religious leaders possessed authentic spiritual authority. Hildegard needed wisdom to avoid becoming entangled in political conflicts that might compromise her prophetic ministry. Her letters to powerful figures like Eleanor of Aquitaine and various bishops show her fearless willingness to challenge authority when she believed God demanded such confrontation. She wrote to Eleanor warning about moral dangers that threatened the Queen's soul. She sent sharp rebukes to bishops who failed in their pastoral duties. She even dared to criticize papal representatives when their actions contradicted divine will as revealed in her visions. These correspondences demonstrate her conviction that prophetic calling transcended ordinary social hierarchy. Frederick Barbarossa himself received letters from Hildegard that challenged his policies toward the Church and warned him about divine judgment for his rebellious actions against papal authority. Few people in medieval Europe possessed the courage to confront the Holy Roman Emperor so directly. Yet Hildegard wrote to him with the same boldness she showed toward corrupt bishops and wealthy nobles. Her prophetic authority enabled her to speak truth to power regardless of earthly rank or political influence. The preaching tours required enormous physical and emotional energy from a woman already past 60 years of age. Medieval travel was exhausting under the best circumstances. Speaking publicly to potentially hostile audiences demanded courage and stamina that few people possessed. Yet Hildegard continued these demanding journeys because she believed God required this public ministry despite her advancing age and the opposition she faced from various quarters. Her audiences included monks, nuns, priests, bishops, and lay people from all levels of medieval society. She spoke to university students in academic centers and to simple farmers in rural communities. Her message adapted to each audience while maintaining consistent themes about the need for spiritual reform and authentic Christian living. She possessed remarkable ability to communicate complex theological concepts in language that ordinary people could understand and apply to their daily lives. These preaching tours established Hildegard as the most influential religious woman of her era, with authority that transcended normal gender restrictions imposed on medieval females. She faced both admiration and controversy as her bold ministry challenged established customs. Her success opened new possibilities for future generations of Christian women who felt called to public ministry. She proved that divine calling could overcome social barriers when exercised with wisdom and supported by authentic spiritual experience. Her prophetic voice commanded respect even from those who disagreed with her specific criticisms or reform proposals. People recognized the authenticity of her spiritual authority even when they resented her particular messages about their behavior or attitudes. This recognition proved that divine calling could establish legitimate religious influence despite conventional limitations placed on women in medieval church life. But Hildegard's influence extended far beyond spoken words. Her creative spirit found another powerful way to touch hearts and lift souls toward heaven. Breathe slowly and imagine a single voice rising in a candlelit chapel, carrying melodies that seem to touch the very edges of heaven. Her Symphonia contains roughly 70 sacred songs, Scholarship cites about 69 surviving musical settings, while some traditions list 77 texts, collected in what she called the Symphony of Heavenly Revelations. This became one of the largest surviving collections of medieval sacred music created by a single composer. Each song represented a direct encounter with divine harmony that Hildegard translated into earthly sound. Her musical style was unlike anything heard in medieval churches before her time. Her music is monophonic chant, often highly melismatic and freer in range than many contemporaneous chants. Traditional sacred music followed strict rules that kept melodies within comfortable ranges and predictable patterns. Composers wrote notes that moved in careful steps, avoiding dramatic leaps or unusual intervals. Church authorities preferred music that supported prayer without drawing attention to itself through flashy displays or emotional excess. Hildegard shattered these conventions with melodies that were wildly melismatic, meaning single syllables stretched across dozens of notes in flowing passages that seemed to have no earthly boundaries. Take her composition O Virga Mediatrix, with its soaring, luminous melismas that push beyond normal octave ranges, demanding singers stretch their voices to reach notes that challenged human vocal limits. The structural daring of her compositions created musical experiences that transported listeners far from ordinary worship into encounters with cosmic mystery. Traditional Gregorian chant was measured and controlled, moving with a steady rhythm of monastic prayer and contemplation. These ancient melodies provided reliable frameworks for community worship that united voices in predictable patterns. Monks and nuns could sing together confidently because they knew exactly where each melody would lead them. The music served prayer rather than dominating it through complex artistic display. Hildegard's melodies soared and swooped like birds in flight, following inspiration rather than conventional rules about how sacred music should behave. Her compositions captured the freedom of divine revelation that refused to be contained within human expectations. Notes climbed toward heaven with urgent longing before descending into gentle valleys of contemplation. The musical lines moved with organic flow that reflected her understanding of how divine love operated in creation. She believed that music was the path to spiritual healing, and that sacred sound connected earth to heaven through vibrations that touched both body and soul. Her theological writings explained how music participated in the cosmic harmony that God established at creation. Every note carried healing power that could restore balance to human spirits damaged by sin and suffering. Singing her compositions became a form of medicine for communities seeking spiritual renewal. Her songs gave voice to a distinctly feminine theological imagination that celebrated divine wisdom and cosmic harmony in ways that male composers had never explored. She wrote about Sophia, the feminine personification of God's wisdom, with melodies that embodied qualities of nurturing, creativity, and life-giving power. Her music honored female saints and biblical women with compositions that recognized their unique contributions to salvation history. Each melody was carefully crafted to match her Latin poetry, creating a synthesis of text and tune that served as vehicles for complex theological meaning. She never separated words from music, but understood them as unified expressions of divine truth. The rise and fall of musical lines reflected the meaning of the text they carried. Dramatic moments in the poetry received soaring melodies, while peaceful passages moved with gentle simplicity. Her theological poetry explored themes that conventional religious writing rarely addressed with such depth and creativity. She wrote about the greening power of God that brought life to creation through divine moisture and fertility. Her texts celebrated the cosmic significance of Christ's incarnation through feminine imagery drawn from nature and human experience. The poetry demanded musical settings that could match its theological richness and emotional intensity. Modern musicians who perform her works describe them as emotionally overwhelming, with a mystical quality that transcends historical periods and speaks directly to contemporary spiritual hunger. Singers report feeling transported into altered states of consciousness when performing her most complex compositions. Audiences often weep during performances without understanding exactly why the music affects them so powerfully. The 800-year gap between composition and performance seems to disappear when her melodies fill concert halls. Her musical innovations influenced how later composers understood the relationship between earthly music and heavenly worship throughout medieval and Renaissance periods. She proved that sacred music could be both deeply spiritual and artistically adventurous without compromising its religious purpose. Her example encouraged other composers to explore more creative approaches to setting religious texts and expressing theological concepts through sound. Recording artists from classical specialists to world music performers have discovered in Hildegard's compositions a musical language that speaks across cultural boundaries to touch universal human experiences of longing, mystery, and transcendence. Her melodies work equally well with period instruments and modern arrangements. Folk musicians, electronic artists, and traditional choir directors all find inspiration in her musical vision. Hildegard's musical legacy proves that true artistic inspiration can break through any historical limitation to speak directly to the human soul regardless of time, place, or cultural context. Her compositions demonstrate how divine revelation can work through creative imagination to produce art that remains eternally fresh and meaningful. The music that emerged from her visions continues to open hearts to mystery and wonder in ways that purely intellectual approaches cannot achieve. Today, her music is performed worldwide, introducing new generations to the sound of medieval mysticism made manifest through melodies that still carry healing power for wounded spirits seeking connection with divine love. Concert halls and churches regularly feature her compositions alongside works by Bach, Mozart, and other classical masters. Her musical voice joins the eternal chorus that proclaims divine glory through human creativity surrendered to sacred purpose. But Hildegard's creative vision extended even beyond the boundaries of existing music and poetry. Her imagination reached into realms where human communication itself could be transformed to serve divine purposes. She invented literary ignoti and a glossary of about 1,000 nouns, preserved in the Riesencodex and a Berlin manuscript. Picture Hildegard sitting in her cell at Rupertsburg, surrounded by pages covered with strange symbols that looked like no alphabet anyone had ever seen. She was creating something that had never existed before in human history. This was not simply another theological work or musical composition. She was building a complete language from nothing, giving it structure and meaning that reflected her unique vision of divine truth. Hildegard created what she called lingua ignota, which means the unknown language. This mysterious creation included its own alphabet and a vocabulary of around 1,000 nouns. She did not simply invent random words or symbols. Each element of this language was carefully designed and purposefully structured. The alphabet flowed with elegant curves that seemed almost otherworldly compared to the angular letters that medieval scribes used in their daily work. Scholars disagree about the purpose of this mysterious language. Some see it as a private code for her community, while others see it as a symbolic, theological vocabulary. The evidence points in multiple directions without offering clear answers. Some historians suggest that lingua ignota functioned as a private communication system that allowed Hildegard's community to discuss sensitive topics without outsiders understanding their conversations. Other experts believe it represented a mystical attempt to create language that could express spiritual truths more accurately than Latin or German. The language included glosses in both Latin and German, which suggests it was meant to be understood and used rather than simply existing as mystical nonsense that impressed visitors with its strangeness. Hildegard provided translations that showed how her invented words related to familiar concepts in existing languages. She created systematic relationships between her new vocabulary and the languages her nuns already knew. This careful organization indicates that she intended people to learn and use lingua ignota for practical purposes. Some words in lingua ignota seem to reflect Hildegard's cosmic vision, with special terms for spiritual concepts that had no equivalent in existing languages. She invented words that captured theological ideas about the relationship between divine and human nature. Her vocabulary included terms for different types of spiritual experiences that could not be expressed accurately using traditional religious language. These unique concepts required new words that could carry meanings unavailable in Latin theological terminology. Other entries in her linguistic creation addressed everyday objects and activities, suggesting that lingua ignota was designed to function as a complete communication system rather than just a collection of mystical terms. She created words for common things like bread, water, clothing, and household items. This comprehensive vocabulary indicates that she envisioned her language being used for ordinary conversation within her religious community, rather than only for special spiritual purposes. The alphabet itself was beautifully designed, with flowing letters that looked almost otherworldly compared to standard medieval scripts that monks and scribes used in their daily writing. Each symbol possessed artistic elegance that made written texts appear more like illuminated artwork than simple communication tools. The letters curved and swirled with graceful movements that suggested divine inspiration rather than human invention. Medieval readers who encountered texts written in these unusual symbols would have been struck by their beauty and mystery. This linguistic invention shows how Hildegard's imagination extended beyond music and theology into the very structure of human communication itself. She understood that language shapes thought, and that new ways of speaking might open pathways to deeper spiritual understanding. Her willingness to create an entirely new system of communication demonstrates her belief that divine inspiration could transform every aspect of human experience, including the most basic tools we use to share ideas with each other. The unknown language might have helped create solidarity within her community by giving the nuns a shared secret that distinguished them from outsiders and strengthened their bonds as a unique religious family. Speaking a private language would have reinforced their sense of being chosen for special divine purposes. It also might have served as a way to express theological ideas that Latin could not capture adequately, providing more precise vocabulary for discussing complex spiritual concepts that arose from Hildegard's mystical experiences. Some scholars have suggested she aimed to recover a sacred or perfect tongue that humans possessed before the Tower of Babel scattered them across the earth with different languages. Medieval theologians believed that Adam and Eve had spoken a pure divine language that was lost when sin entered the world. Hildegard might have been trying to reconstruct this original perfect communication system through divine inspiration and careful linguistic design. The practical uses of this invented language remain largely mysterious because so little evidence survives about how Hildegard's community actually employed it in their daily lives. We know that at least some of her nuns learned the vocabulary and alphabet because manuscripts preserve songs and texts written in lingua ignota. However, we cannot determine whether they used it regularly for conversation or only for special ceremonial purposes. The scarcity of surviving materials makes it difficult for scholars to fully understand how extensive Hildegard's linguistic project really was. We may be seeing only fragments of a much larger creative achievement that has been lost to history through the accidents of manuscript preservation and the passage of centuries. Even in secret words, she sought to make ordinary speech a way into prayer. Lingua ignota demonstrates Hildegard's belief that divine inspiration could transform even language itself into a vehicle for approaching the sacred mysteries that ordinary human speech could not adequately express. She saw no boundaries to how creative inspiration might serve divine revelation. This invented language stands as proof that Hildegard saw no limits to how human creativity could serve divine purposes and open new pathways for spiritual understanding. But her most extraordinary revelations were yet to come. The visions that would establish her as one of medieval Europe's most systematic theological thinkers would soon unfold with breathtaking scope and detail. Her second major work, Liber Vitae Meritorum, c. 1158, 1163, and her final masterpiece, Liber Divinorum Operum, begun c. 1163 and finished c. 1172-74, contained large-scale visionary theology that explored creation, redemption, and the cosmic significance of divine love. These were not simple spiritual insights or moral teachings. God was showing her allegories on creation and redemption, virtues battling vices, microcosm and macrocosm analogies, and a detailed meditation on the prologue to John's Gospel. In the beginning was the Word. Her later theological works expanded far beyond anything she had written before. These massive projects required years of careful composition with her faithful scribe Volmar. Each vision demanded detailed explanation that connected cosmic mysteries to practical Christian living. The scope of these revelations challenged medieval understanding of how much divine truth one human mind could receive and communicate. These visions were far more complex than her earlier work in Civiers. Where her first visionary work had focused primarily on salvation history and church life, these later revelations explored the deepest structures of existence itself. She received insights into how spiritual and material worlds connected through patterns that repeated at every level of creation. The Book of Life's Merits dramatized the soul's eternal contest between 7 deadly vices and 7 corresponding virtues, offering one of the earliest detailed descriptions of purgatory in Christian literature. Hildegard watched as pride battled humility, envy fought charity, and anger wrestled with patience in cosmic dramas that determined each soul's spiritual destiny. These were not abstract moral categories, but living forces engaged in real warfare for human hearts. She described purgatory as a place of purifying fire, where souls learn to choose virtue over vice through painful but healing experiences. This intermediate state between earth and heaven allowed gradual transformation that prepared souls for divine union. Medieval theology was just beginning to develop clear teaching about purgatory. Hildegard's detailed visions contributed significantly to church understanding of how divine mercy worked through purifying suffering. Her Book of Divine Works centered on the prologue to John's Gospel, showing how the divine word shaped all creation through feminine energies of love and wisdom that medieval theologians called Sophia. She watched as God's creative power worked through these feminine aspects of divine nature to bring order from chaos and life from emptiness. The cosmic Christ who existed before all ages continued to sustain creation through ongoing creative activity. Central to all her cosmic visions was the concept she called viriditas, meaning greening power or greenness. This was God's life-giving energy flowing through all creation, the divine force that brought growth, healing, and renewal to everything that existed. Viriditas was not simply a theological concept, but a living reality she could perceive throughout the natural world. Every plant that sprouted, every flower that bloomed, every tree that leafed carried this divine greening power as visible proof of God's presence. If you see a small green shoot on a windowsill, Hildegard would say it is a sign of God's life present to you now. The same divine energy that creates new growth in plants works within human souls to bring spiritual renewal and healing. Creation itself bears witness to God through this continuous flow of life-giving power that connects all things in sacred relationship. These works revealed sophisticated understanding that linked microcosm and macrocosm through sacramental vision that saw divine activity everywhere in creation. Human beings contained the entire universe within their spiritual nature. Every person reflected cosmic patterns in miniature form. The same divine energies that moved planets and stars also worked within individual hearts to create spiritual transformation. Hildegard described the universe as a living organism where every part reflected divine nature and participated in cosmic harmony that connected all created things. Stars influenced earthly events not through magical forces, but through genuine spiritual connections that God established at creation. Human actions affected the entire cosmic order because individual souls participated in universal spiritual patterns. Her cosmic visions included detailed explanations of salvation history that showed how Christ's incarnation restored broken harmony between heaven and earth. The divine word that spoke creation into existence became human flesh to heal the damage that sin had inflicted on cosmic order. Christ's death and resurrection did not simply forgive human guilt, but actually repaired spiritual connections between God and creation. She received remarkable insights into the nature of angels and their role in maintaining cosmic order through continuous worship and service. Different orders of angels governed various aspects of creation, from the movement of celestial bodies to the growth of plants and animals. These spiritual beings carried divine messages throughout the universe and helped human souls understand their place within the greater cosmic story. Her visions revealed the final transformation of creation when Christ would return to complete the work of universal restoration. She saw how all things would be renewed and perfected in ways that exceeded their original created glory. The new heaven and new earth would represent creation finally achieving its intended purpose of reflecting divine beauty perfectly. These cosmic visions established Hildegard as one of the most systematic theological thinkers of the medieval period. She understood creation as a unified living system centuries before scientists developed ecological concepts about interconnected natural relationships. Her theology emphasized divine presence throughout creation, rather than separation between sacred and secular realms. Her ability to see divine activity throughout creation offered a uniquely feminine perspective on theology that emphasized relationship and interconnection over hierarchy and separation. Where male theologians often stressed divine transcendence and human unworthiness, Hildegard celebrated divine immanence and cosmic participation. She saw creation as God's body and humanity as creation's crown, called to conscious cooperation with divine creativity. These monumental theological works secured Hildegard's reputation as a visionary whose insights into divine mysteries rivaled those of the greatest church fathers and scholastic theologians. Her cosmic perspective influenced Christian thought for centuries and continues to inspire contemporary theologians seeking to understand divine presence within creation itself. But even the most revered saints must face their final tests. Hildegard's greatest challenge would come not from theological opponents or corrupt bishops, but from her own church authorities in the last months of her extraordinary life. At 81, Hildegard faced a local dispute that would test her convictions one final time. A young nobleman died and was buried in the cemetery at Rupertsburg Convent. This should have been a simple matter of Christian charity. The young man's family brought his body to Hildegard's community, seeking proper burial in consecrated ground. They insisted he had received the last sacraments and died in good standing with the church. Hildegard examined the evidence carefully and agreed to allow the burial in her convent's cemetery. Church authorities in the region saw things differently. They claimed the young man had died under some form of church censure that made him unworthy of Christian burial. They demanded that Hildegard's community dig up the body and remove it from consecrated ground. The dispute escalated quickly as both sides insisted they possessed the correct information about the deceased man's spiritual condition at the time of his death. When Hildegard refused to comply with their demands, the church authorities imposed an interdict on her entire convent. This was one of the most severe punishments available to medieval religious leaders. The interdict meant her nuns could not receive communion during Massachusetts. They could not sing the divine office that structured their daily prayers. They could not participate in normal religious life that gave meaning and purpose to their existence as a community devoted to God's service. For a musical community that had spent decades creating heavenly harmonies, this silence was devastating beyond words. Imagine the chapel at Rupertsburg suddenly empty of the voices that had filled it with Hildegard's revolutionary compositions. The nuns who had learned to sing melodies that soared toward heaven now sat in forced quiet, while their hearts ached for the music that connected them to divine love. Their spiritual life felt broken and incomplete without the songs that had become their pathway to God. Hildegard argued the man had been reconciled and refused to exhume him despite the enormous pressure this punishment placed on her entire community. Her investigation had convinced her that the accusations against him were false or based on incomplete information. She would not violate her conscience by removing a body that had been properly buried with full Christian rites. This final confrontation showed that even at her advanced age, she would not compromise her principles for ecclesiastical convenience or political pressure. The same fierce determination that had driven her to establish an independent convent now sustained her through this painful dispute with church authorities. She had spent her entire life following divine commands, even when they conflicted with human expectations. This last battle followed the same pattern of obedience to God rather than earthly powers. The interdict created enormous suffering for her community during what would prove to be Hildegard's final months of life. Her nuns watched their beloved abbess grow weaker, while they could not even celebrate Mass together or sing the prayers that had sustained them through previous difficulties. The silence in their chapel must have felt like a preview of the greater silence that would come when Hildegard's own voice was finally stilled by death. Yet she maintained her position with unwavering conviction that justice demanded proper treatment for the deceased young nobleman. Her letters from this period show no sign of doubt or compromise about her decision to protect his right to Christian burial. She had examined the evidence carefully and reached a conclusion based on what she believed God required of her as a spiritual leader responsible for her community's moral integrity. The interdict was eventually lifted only months before her death in September 1179, vindicating her stand but showing the ongoing tensions she faced throughout her remarkable life. Church authorities finally acknowledged that her position had been correct and that the young man deserved the Christian burial she had provided. This late vindication must have brought comfort to Hildegard as she prepared for her own departure from earthly life. Her influence continued to grow after death, inspiring countless religious women throughout medieval Europe and beyond. Her writings circulated widely among monasteries and convents. Her musical compositions continued to be sung in communities that valued her artistic and spiritual legacy. Her theological insights influenced church teaching about mystical experience and divine revelation for centuries after her death. Hildegard had local veneration for centuries and was included in the Roman martyrology. In 2012, Pope Benedict XVI extended her cult through equivalent canonization, officially recognizing her as a saint. He also declared her a doctor of the Church, acknowledging what believers had known for 800 years. This rare honor places her among the most influential religious thinkers of all time. Her cosmic visions and mystical insights earned recognition alongside the works of Augustine, Aquinas, and other giants of Christian theology. The sickly child who once seemed destined for obscurity achieved the highest honors the Church could bestow. Today, she even inspires playful medieval-style covers online through channels like Hildegard von Bingen that create bardcore versions of modern pop songs. This contemporary homage introduces new generations to her name through creative adaptations that blend current music with medieval aesthetics. The channel's approach honors her innovative spirit while sharing her legacy with audiences who might never encounter her theological writings through traditional means. From sickly child to doctor of the Church to bardcore inspiration, Hildegard's journey proves that God's plans often exceed our wildest imagination when we surrender our perceived weaknesses to divine purpose. Her courage in suffering shows us that faithfulness sometimes demands standing alone against earthly powers when divine truth is at stake. Tonight, as you rest, remember that the God who spoke through a sickly medieval child still speaks through unexpected people in unexpected ways. Hildegard's journey from forgotten oblate to doctor of the Church shows us that our weaknesses often become doorways for divine strength. Her chronic illness opened her heart to visions that left a lasting spiritual and cultural legacy that continues to inspire. Let her story encourage you to listen for the gentle voice that calls each of us to use our unique gifts in service of something greater than ourselves. Tonight, try this simple breath prayer from her tradition. Breath of God, green my heart, renew me with your peace. Amen. If this quiet story steadied your heart, consider subscribing so these short reflections meet you again at night. Rest knowing that perceived weakness can become the very place where God's strength takes root.